Welcome and thank you for being here. I'm Kimberly Hokinson, Director of Annual Membership Programs and Operations at the MFA. We're delighted that so many members could join us for tonight's lecture. We appreciate your support and your participation in the MFA's virtual member lecture series. This program is coming to you virtually from the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. Founded in 1870, the MFA stands on a site which has long served as a place of meeting and exchange among different Algonquin nations, including the Massachusetts. As a museum, we acknowledge the long histories of the land we occupy today and seek ways to make Indigenous narratives more prominent in our galleries and programming. We can all learn more about the Massachusetts people who continue to be the stewards of this land by visiting massachusettstribe.org. Before I introduce our speaker, a few logistical notes. To enable captions, go to the meeting controls. Next to the show captions icon, click the up arrow icon and select the show caption window option. During the presentation, please use Zoom's Q&A function to submit questions for the question and answer portion of the lecture. And please note that this lecture is being recorded and will be available through the MFA website for members to view next month. And now I am pleased to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Erica E. Hirshler. Erica joined the MFA in 1983 and was named Croll Senior Curator of American Paintings, Art of the Americas in 2001. An expert in late 19th and early 20th century American painting, she has published extensively on John Singer Sargent, Mary Cassatt, Childe Hassam, and a range of other artists. Erica is particularly interested in the vibrant artistic exchange between the United States and Europe, in issues of national identity, and in the new opportunities available to women during this period. She also studies Boston's history, art, and patronage. She has written for both scholarly and popular journals and is a much sought after speaker. Erica holds a BA from Wellesley College and an MA and a PhD from Boston University. I'm pleased to turn it over to Erica.
Thank you so much, Kimberly, and welcome to everyone who's joined our Zoom webinar today. It's a great pleasure for me to speak with you. I only wish we were all in one room together. I can't see your faces. I hope my jokes are funny. It is a show that I hope most of you will be able to see. The exhibition dates are listed on the screen. And the show will be open in Boston until January 15th, 2024. It will then travel to Tate Britain in London from February to July. And I do so hope that many of you will be able to see it in person. I often get asked how these shows happen, how you get the idea, and how long it takes. So I thought I would begin tonight by giving you a little bit of that behind the scenes information. I came up with the idea for this show after I presented a paper in Paris in 2016. The Petit Palais was giving an exhibition about Oscar Wilde, and they had a symposium and asked me to speak about Sargent's portraits of men, including Dr. Pozzi, who you see here at the center of the screen, and Lord Ribblesdale, who you see on the right. I was fascinated by what the clothing told us about who these gentlemen were, and I decided that it would make sense to think about that more broadly within Sargent's career. So I proposed that idea to my colleague Pam Parmel in the Department of Textile and Fashion Arts, and together we proposed it to the director and the exhibition team here at the MFA in 2017. Some of our members might recall that we did a little exploratory exhibition, an exhibition lab in the fall of 2018, where we tested out some of the ideas and display techniques that we hope to employ in the larger exhibition. And you're seeing a couple of installation shots from that exhibition lab here. We also solicited feedback from our visitors, trying to figure out what was of most interest, which things they liked the best, and so on. Never fear, we made great use of a lot of it. These are the sorts of questions we asked. What kind of mannequin makes the most sense to you? One that fully evokes a human form, or what we call an invisible mannequin, where you can only see the dress? Or what do you think of people who are dressed in clothing from cultures not their own? How do we deal with issues of cultural appropriation? What would you like to know about it? As you can see from this slide, we got lots of commentary, both written and drawn, and we put that to good use in the exhibition itself, as I hope you'll see when we get to those segments. Well, it takes a long time to put a show like this together, and I'd like to thank the Terra Foundation, who provided funding for us to have also scholarly convenings, 2 of them, one in Boston and one in London, where we shared ideas with colleagues in the field of art history, Sargent studies, British art, and fashion history. We talked to many people in the field and discussed the checklist, sorted through it several times, tried to come up with themes that made sense for Sargent's work and for our visitors, and worked very closely with our colleagues at Tate Britain, as you can see in the slide at the upper left. Caroline Corbeau-Parsons, who you see here second from left, was our curatorial colleague at that point. And Pam and Caroline and I worked through the exhibition many, many times. All I can say, it's a really good thing that the bar at Heathrow is named the Curator. We also made a lot of collection visits, as you can see from these slides, of 2 of our field trips out from central London. On the left, the Ellen Terry Museum, called Small Hive in Kent, which was Ellen Terry's summer home, a beautiful old English half-timbered house covered with pink roses that also includes a collection of her costumes, including the famous beetle wing dress now on view in the Gun Gallery. Or at the right, one of the great British country houses that still had in its collection family members and their clothes. And in fact, that's where we were in March 2020, when the world shut down, and we were asked to get ourselves out of that country house, back on a plane, and back to the United States as soon as we possibly could. Well, no one knew exactly what was going to happen, except we all knew that international shipping had come to a halt and that we were going to have to rethink our plans. We continued to work virtually. We worked a lot on the catalog, the book that accompanies the show, keeping up with our authors, taking in their essays and working together to fashion essays as much as Sargent fashioned clothes. It was also clear that the show was going to have to be postponed, but I'm really happy to say that no one at the MFA or at the Tate lost faith in the project. We renegotiated our dates with our partners in Britain, who were such major players and major lenders to the exhibition. I'm showing you a wall at the Tate Gallery just this past January, where 3 of the stars of our show were on view for London's public. We also had to renegotiate all of our loans. 31 different lenders agreed to our new dates, and our curatorial ideas changed, and the staff even changed, as Caroline took a different job in Paris at the Orsay, and her colleague James Finch took over as the Tate's representative. Pam Parmel took a retirement, And I'm glad to say that when Theo Tyson, our new curator of fashion, came to the MFA, she offered invaluable advice. We had a new exhibition designer who came up with a completely new way of using the gunned gallery, an exciting method that allowed us to have a grand salon gallery from corner to corner of what's basically an empty box. That new conception was sort of mind-blowing for me, and I'm very grateful to Louisa for thinking of new ways to use the space. I'm showing you here some of her amazing drawings, preliminary drawings for the exhibition. But I think what Louisa really managed to do was to take my idea of portraiture as a performance and make it come to life. Portraits are costumed, they're staged, and in Sargent's case, they're most often presented to the public before they go into anybody's living room. In other words, he often told people what to wear. He carefully posed them, and he asked that he could exhibit the portraits, often in Paris at the Salon, or in London at the Royal Academy, or sometimes in sometimes in Boston, as you'll see in a moment. So they were open to public criticism, just like a theatrical performance. And Louisa's idea of draping the lobby as if it were a theater set seemed to go together with my ideas about how portraits were made and how they were received. I also like the idea of showing fabric, real fabric, in 3 dimensions, so that you could see what happens when light hits folds and drapes, something that was especially important to Sargent. Our show begins with one comparison. It's an appetizer, perhaps, to the rest of the exhibition. The single comparison also inspired the color palette of both the lobby and the first exhibition space. The idea was to invite you into this cloak, a black silk taffeta cloak with a bright pink lining, an opera cloak of a type that was worn before a night of entertainment. As you walk into the first room, it's as if you were putting on that cloak. And we see Sargent working with Aline Rothschild Sassoon to make a dramatic portrait that both takes in the quality of the garment that she's wearing and also uses it to make something quite different. I'm showing you here the Sargent portrait and the opera cloak, along with 2 other views of the opera cloak as we saw it in the collector's home. You can see how the light hits that silk taffeta, how it shimmers in different lights, an aspect of the fabric that Sargent certainly was intrigued by. Painting black on black was one of his favorite things. You're also seeing here the cloak entirely open, but I hope you'll notice that when it's worn, it falls straight down from the neck, and you only get small glimpses of that bright pink satin lining down the front at the gaps in the opening and also in the insides of the sleeves. You also see here an earlier photograph of Aline Rothschild Sassoon, and you can see, I think, that Sargent captured this beautiful woman with her fine features and her good humor. She was the daughter of the Rothschilds. She grew up in Paris. She was well educated and a lover of art, and she and Sargent hit it off and became good friends. That's probably why she didn't mind wearing a 10-year-old opera cloak when Sargent painted her portrait. The portrait made in the early 20th century, the opera cloak dating from the 1890s with these big sleeves so characteristic of fashion then, and also, as you can see in the exhibition as you walk around the case, a lot of fabric in the back that would have accommodated a dress with a bustle. What Sargent does in the painting is take charge of that opera cloak. he's not only selected it, but he's wrapped and draped it in a very particular way. You can see that he's pulled it off Aline's shoulders just a little bit, opening it up, and then taking it and pulling it across her body and turning it around so that you get a lapel of pink satin that he uses as a device to link together her beautiful face and her delicate hands. That great swoop of pink paint adds energy and liveliness to the portrait, assisting with the idea that this was a woman on the move, dressed to go out, maybe walking outside the picture with the cloak full of movement and vitality that Sargent gave it in every brushstroke. Well, Aline is walking right into the next gallery of the exhibition, which gives an impression of an artist's studio. In this case, modeled after the window design in Sargent's own studio in London, in Chelsea on Tite Street, which you can see you can see on the right-hand side of the composition. There I am a couple of years ago, standing in the doorway, very excited to get inside this still privately owned artist's studio. I'm showing you also a photograph from the Sargent archive at the Museum of Fine Arts in our collection that shows that window in Sargent's day, probably in the 1920s. We chose the idea of showing an artist's studio because we wanted this gallery to think about Sargent's own artistic preferences. We know that Sargent enjoyed painting black on black and white on white more often than any other color. A colleague of mine, Anna Reynolds, who wrote an essay for the catalog, has tabulated all of Sargent's portraits and matched them up with either the surviving garments or else garments that are very similar to the ones that Sargent represented. He painted people in black or in white more often than he painted any other color, despite the great variety of colors and tones available to him, despite the popularity of prints and stripes. Sargent preferred painting in monochrome, most often in black or in white. It was technically difficult, hard to render three-dimensional form when you're only using one color. But he was inspired by the old masters, both Velázquez, who you see here at lower right, a detail from his famous portrait Las Meninas at the Prado, which Sargent had seen and copied in 1879. At the left, a painting by Frans Hals, a Dutch painter Sargent very much admired, who was also particularly known for his painting in black on black and white on white. This reverence for the great artists of the past is very much a part of Sargent's work from the beginning. Well, you might wonder how Sargent learned all this. Sargent was born in Italy to American parents, and he first studied art at the Academy in Florence, but only briefly, because like any aspiring American artist, or in fact, any artist from many different places around the world in the late 19th century, they all knew that the capital of the art world was Paris. And Sargent headed there with his family in 1874, first studying at the École des Beaux-Arts, a very strict, traditional academic program run by the French state that held in great trust traditional ways of learning how to be a painter, starting with drawing after antique casts of classical sculpture, and only after you had mastered that were you ever allowed to pick up a paintbrush. But at the same time, Sargent also studied with one of the most stylish portraitists in Paris, Carolus Duran, known for his beautiful portraits of attractive women in Paris. Carolus took a different approach altogether. He advised his students, first of all, to ceaselessly study Velázquez, and second of all, to paint directly on canvas, not to fuss around with pencil drawings and sketches, but to take the brush and paint in what was called alla prima, directly on the canvas. And that combination in Sargent's training of a traditional kind of approach and a new sort of modern, immediate approach informed all of his work. He was always on a tightrope between his admiration for art of the past and his excitement about the modern world of which he was a part. In this gallery, you also see several portraits in black and white that shows Sargent's technical ability. On the left, a portrait of Madame Ramon Subercaseaux, the wife of a French a diplomat from Chile posted to France, who is posed in her own apartment. In her own memoirs, she writes that Sargent had free rein to come and decide where she should sit, how she should pose, and probably what she should wear. It's a very modern portrait. She's turned around just for an instant. In portraiture, this is the equivalent of impressionism, showing somebody in a moment that's only going to last for a little bit. She's going to turn right back around and go back to the piano. It's a symphony of blacks and whites with an especial tour de force, that waterfall of black ribbon and black lace cascading through white ruffles and white lace down the front of her gown. On the right, you see Mrs. Eleanor Iselin, the wife of a New York financier. Sargent came to paint her portrait in 1887-88 on his first working trip to the United States. He went to the Iselins' apartment too, to talk to them about how the portrait should be made, how big it should be, how much it was going to cost, and how many sittings it would require. For that occasion, Mrs. Iselin had her maid show Sargent 6 of her most favorite Worth gowns, hoping he would pick one of them in which to paint her portrait. But Sargent said, "No, I'd like to paint you in exactly what you have on." Mrs. Iselin was wearing a day dress out of black satin, something that would have been appropriate to host a distinguished visitor in her home, but certainly not the gallant party dress that she might have hoped to wear in her portrait. But Sargent made a feast of it, showing that black satin in different lights, using grays and darker blacks and elements of dark, dark blues to show how the light hits the sheen of that satin, giving her three-dimensionality in the way the dress is rendered. The dress was decorated with bits of black jet that you can see at the ends of her sleeves and at the waistline. But Sargent doesn't paint them in any detail. He doesn't give you the patterns that were embroidered and beaded onto her garment. Instead, he only shows you what the light sees. He gives you the sheen, but not the detail, a magical rendition of fabric and fashion. Well, the next gallery, we wanted to explore the relationship of women and their clothes, adding that context to the idea of being fashioned by Sargent. I should point out that our exhibition is arranged thematically rather than chronologically. I've seen a lot of Sargent shows that start at the beginning in the 1870s and go through to the end in date order. But for this exhibition, I was fascinated with the themes that came through about how Sargent handled cloth, how he painted fashion, and his relationships with his sitters. So instead of a chronological display, we have a thematic one. Here, as I said, it's about women and their clothing. The portrait that you see on your left is of a Bostonian, although the painting comes to us as a loan from the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston. Sarah Choate Sears was a great friend of Sargent's. She was an artist herself, both a painter and a pictorialist photographer who exhibited her photographs internationally. She lived in Boston at 12 Arlington Street, where she and her husband, J. Montgomery Sears, acquired a great collection of both American and European art. Artists you may have heard of, like Edward Manet, Claude Monet, Sargent, Cassatt, Abbott Thayer. And she may have been quite sympathetic to Sargent's own artistic interest in painting white on white, because here she appears in a beautiful white dress, not shown in great detail, but you absolutely get the shimmer of white satin. It's interesting that she's painted in white because, in fact, the MFA owns Sarah Sears's wardrobe, which was given to us by her daughter Helen in the 1950s. And I'm showing you two of Sarah Sears's dresses here on the right, a blue, sapphire blue velvet walking dress from the late 1870s on the far right, and its center, an acid green ball gown with the wide sleeves characteristic of the 1890s at the center. Here we talk about clothing for women of this class being used as social armor, as Edith Wharton described it in her novel, The Age of Innocence. It was the importance of knowing the right thing to wear at the right time of day for the right occasion by the right designer. This gave women the confidence to go out into these social affairs, knowing that they were doing the right thing. They might have chosen to dress up, they might have chosen to dress down, but you could only do that if you knew what was expected. And women used that, as I said, as Wharton described, as a way of building confidence or social armor. We still do it today, and that's something I want to remind our visitors. We think a lot about what we should wear when we're performing on Zoom, for example, or what we should wear when we go to an event. Clothing also has sentimental value. The fact that these gowns were saved shows that they have meaning, much as we might save our wedding gown or our t-shirt from the last favorite rock concert that we went to. I would remind us, too, that this is the age of couture as we know it. In earlier times, one might have had a seamstress make a special dress for us based on designs that were reproduced and described in the press or on things that we saw our colleagues wearing. But by the mid-1850s, we start to see the grand fashion houses of Paris. Today, they might be Alexander McQueen or Chanel or Yves Saint Laurent. But in the 19th century, the most famous house was the House of Worth on the Rue de la Paix in Paris. And I'm showing you a label from that house at the center and an image of Charles Worth above it. I would point out that many women took the labels out of their clothes to avoid the tariff duties that affected foreign goods when they were imported into the United States. And on the right, you see a cartoon of women actually at an art exhibition who are talking about the portraits and how apparently the dress is by Worth. The fashionability of the art exhibition, both in terms of the women who came to it, but also the women who were represented in it, were of prime importance in the 19th century. Well, what happens then when all of your decisions and all of your desires about what to wear are subverted by an artist? Mrs. Fisk Warren wanted to wear her favorite green gown when she posed for Sargent in 1903. Mrs. Fisk Warren's portrait sittings are among the very, very few that are documented in contemporary photographs, as you can see in this image on the right from the collection of the Gardner Museum, made by J. Templeton Coolidge, and showing Mrs. Fisk Warren seated in a chair with her daughter while Sargent paints her. The setting is the Gothic room at the Gardner, Fenway Court, where Sargent set up a temporary studio in 1903. And I think it's partly that room, which you see on the right, a couple of years ago when we lent Mrs. Fisk Warren to be reunited with her setting in the Gardner. I think it was that room that really gave Sargent his idea for the painting. The room is full of browns and golds and reds between the upholstery of the furniture and the gilding of the sculpture in the room, the furniture, the candelabra, all of which appear in the background of Sargent's portrait. Mrs. Warren had honey gold hair, and he just decided that green wasn't going to do, and he asked her to wear something lighter and something in a pinkish tone. She borrowed a dress from her sister-in-law, which didn't fit. And Rachel might not even be wearing a dress. If you look carefully at both the painting and the photograph, it looks like perhaps a sheet of pink fabric was draped around her that Sargent invented into a dress for the painting. Sargent was always thinking about picture making, about how his painting would last beyond the lives of his sitters and pass through time. Mrs. Warren is said not to have loved her painting, maybe because she didn't get to wear her favorite green dress, but it was lent to a number of Sargent exhibitions, and critics wrote, "What an heirloom to pass down. A painting that was going to be timeless, something that lasted beyond both Sargent's time and those of his sitters, something that lasts into our time and hopefully beyond." The next section of our exhibition explores the ideas of gender. We've heard for all through time that clothes make the man, as it has so often been said. And I'm comparing here two images of men from the exhibition. On the left, Sargent's portrait of Henry Lee Higginson, and on the right, his portrait of Samuel Putzie. You couldn't get more different than these two images of masculinity. Higginson, conventional; Putzie, completely unconventional. Sargent's most unconventional portrait of a man. A rather stereotypical image of a man versus something edgy and something that is almost outrageous. Let's look at them a little bit more closely. Here, comparing the portraits to photographs of the sitters. Henry Higginson's portrait was commissioned by Harvard in 1903, particularly to hang in the Harvard Union, a new gathering place for Harvard students that Higginson had largely funded. You may also know Higginson as a banker in Boston, an investor, the man who handled Sargent's money as it happened, but a great supporter of the arts and the founder of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. He's shown in a quintessentially masculine way, one arm hooked over the back of the chair in a golden Rembrandtesque light, both the pose and the palette adopted from old master paintings. But it's a modern portrait as well. Higginson is wearing a brown wool business suit, looking very distinguished. He has something draped over his lap. It's a cloak. In fact, his cloak from the Massachusetts cavalry during the Civil War, where Higginson not only served, but received the saber scar that you can see highlighted in the photograph and also on the lit side of his cheek in Sargent's portrait of him. This is a painting that stood perhaps as a lesson, a model to the men of Harvard, a man of distinguished business acumen, a man of great patronage in his fostering of the Boston Symphony, a man of service for his service in the Civil War. These are moral lessons, perhaps, for what was then a school that only admitted men. Well, Pozzi was a very distinguished figure as well. You can see him on the right in a lovely tailored suit of the type that he would have worn around the city of Paris. He was a distinguished surgeon and a member of the Faculty of Medicine at that important university in Paris. And I might just remind you that the color of the Faculty of Medicine there was red. But Sargent doesn't show him as you would normally expect to see a distinguished physician, perhaps in his office or in the operating theater, in action at work or studying behind a wall of books. Instead, Sargent chose to show Samuel Pozzi at home. As I said, it's the most unconventional of masculine portraits. We see him in his dressing gown, in a space that is somewhere between public and private, backed by a great red velvet curtain that looks as if he has just stepped out on stage to acknowledge his audience. While Pozzi wasn't only a distinguished surgeon, he was also a member of the artistic circles in Paris in the late 19th century, the so-called decadents, who were interested in all of the exotics, all of the exotic things, interested in dreams, interested in art, poets and writers like Montesquieu and Proust, people like Whistler, who were always at the edge of fashionability and drama. And that's the Pozzi that Sargent chose to show. That's the man that had attracted his attention. We see fashion being used to evoke authority in an interesting way in the portrait on the right, a portrait of Jane Evans, one of the few women to hold a position of authority at Eton College, that distinguished boys' boarding school in Britain. She was one of the only women ever to lead one of the residential houses at Eton. And this portrait, which is still owned by Eton, was commissioned by her former students to hang in Evans' house. Look at what she's wearing and look at how she's posed. We see here all the aspects of male portraiture and menswear to communicate the authority of this both strong and also sympathetic woman. Head in hand, she's borrowed a pose that's often used for male portraiture, and her outfit is the woman's equivalent, black wool suit, tailored for women, but with all the severity of Higginson's business suit. She wears at her waist the fob of her office, like a man's watch chain. She's distinctly feminine with a small cap on her head and her sympathetic gaze, but the look of a man's portrait offers to her much, much authority, something that would look very different to us if she were wearing pink satin and lace. Well, this co-opting of menswear was used by many women who were coming into the professions during the 19th century. The late 19th century is when women's colleges are founded, when women become doctors and lawyers and social reformers, when they found the Audubon Society and start to get interested in and active in political events and in suffrage. Many of those women wear outfits that are tailored after menswear. Other women co-opted aspects of menswear to better align with their true selves, and that we see in the portrait at center, Sargent's portrait of Vernon Lee. If you think Vernon Lee was a man, if you think from this portrait that you're looking at a man, you'd be wrong. Vernon Lee was Sargent's childhood friend, Violet Paget. She was a lesbian writer, critic, and important commentator on life of her time. She didn't wear men's clothing, but she wore very tailored outfits that evoke menswear. The stand-up Gladstone collar that she wears in Sargent's portrait, the dark clothes and the severe tailoring, the bangs, the spectacles, all of them more in keeping with her own feelings about herself and the role that she played in a more gender fluid society than we often give the 19th century credit for being. Clothing might be strictly gendered, but the people who wore them were not. Here we see W. Graham Robertson on the left in Sargent's beautiful portrait of him in an interior against a screen, holding a jade-handled cane with his elderly poodle lying at his feet. Robertson is wearing a Chesterfield overcoat, a typical overcoat for men of the day, but one that was wrapped tightly and ever more tightly around him by Sargent during these sittings, to make him have a pencil-thin silhouette, to make him look, as one critic wrote, the ideal dandy of our present age of grace. I'm showing you here a double portrait, a manipulated photograph. Both of the gentlemen at center are Graham Robertson, so you can see what he really looked like. And on the right, a cartoon from Vanity Fair magazine showing Whistler as a dandy, also with a small thin cane and dressed tightly in an overcoat. Sargent had approached Robertson, who was a designer, very much a part of Oscar Wilde's social circle. He had designed the sets for Oscar Wilde's production of Salome and was very active in the circle of artistic young men in London. He posed Robertson in that cloak, even though it was August and it was hot and the coat was wool, and Sargent kept wrapping it around and pulling it tighter. And when Robertson complained, Sargent said, "You must wear it. The coat is the picture." And indeed, it's the coat that identifies Robertson as a member of that aesthetic circle. The idea of dress up happens often in Sargent's work. Here is his friend Ina Wertheimer, looking as if she were one of the Three Musketeers. She's burst into Sargent's studio, and he's dressed her up in a cape, making her seem like a swordsman, but it's all confected out of a piece of cloth and a broomstick. That idea of dressing up leads us into a section that talks about performance. Sargent's portrait of the great Spanish bolero dancer Carmencita, one of the stars of the stage, whose costume is included in our exhibition. I'm showing you here at center a photograph of her dancing in an artist's studio in 1890, which is where Sargent painted her. You can also see on YouTube or at the Library of Congress Thomas Edison's film of her dancing. But Sargent shows her standing still, all of her movement instead encapsulated in the quick flicks of paint that he used to capture her gown, the sequins and beads, not illuminated in any detail, but instead just flickering as if the movement had just stopped in the midst of her dance. For the great actress Ellen Terry, Sargent was in the audience opening night when she appeared as Lady Macbeth in Henry Irving's Lyceum Theater production. He thought of different compositional formats for her, but ended up choosing a scene that wasn't in the play at all, of her holding up the crown of Scotland as if she were going to put it on her own head rather than on her husband's. Her beetle wing dress, an exceptional loan from the National Trust, was her most famous costume. And we can see it, green wool intertwined with blue tinsel and decorated with the iridescent wings of jewel beetles. Sargent makes it look more blue on the advice, perhaps, of Edward Burne-Jones, who visited his studio during the sittings. We also think that perhaps the costume looked a little bit different in stage light of the day. Well, this idea of dressing up is something that we asked about during the exhibition lab. And here you see Almina Wertheimer again, as we showed her in reproduction for that lab. And we took our visitors' advice and included in the exhibition an example of one of these Turkish coats, not Sargent's, which you see in a photograph of his niece Rosemary wearing Sargent's studio prop of a Turkish Antari. But Sargent's doesn't survive. So instead, we've substituted an example quite similar from our own collection so that you can see how these garments were actually worn. Well, they weren't worn like the late 19th century painters of harem scenes showed them, like you can see in the image at the top left of the trio on the right-hand side. Is this cultural appropriation? Or is this dress up of its day, the way people dressed for fancy dress balls and costume parties, Oktoberfest, and Halloween? Or was Almina Wertheimer in on the joke? You see it upper right, an interesting photograph of another Jewish Londoner, Rachel Sassoon, wearing Turkish dress in a carte de visite photograph that she herself distributed. Perhaps a play on the idea that Londoners had of setting Jewish women apart as exotic, different, no matter their wealth or their social station, different from the British aristocracy. Or is this painting, in fact, a riff on a painting by Reynolds, which you see in black and white at the bottom, a painting that had been stolen from Almina's uncle the year before? Was this Sargent and Almina making a replacement for it? We're never going to know the answers to all of these questions, but we show it in all of its many iterations and possibilities to show that sometimes these issues of dressing up are entirely complicated and can be more complicated by who's wearing them and what for. The woman who used dress more than perhaps anybody else for social recognition was Madame X, Madame Virginie Avegno-Gautreau, who you see here on the left in an exceptional loan from the Metropolitan, and on the right in a photograph as she appeared in the Salon when it was first displayed in May of 1884. Sargent had asked to paint Virginie Gautreau. It was a difficult sitting. She didn't want to pose for very long. He tried lots of different compositions before settling on something that was very stark and very performative. Madame Gautreau thought it was a masterpiece. She wrote that in this letter in the Sargent archive at the MFA, saying that Sargent had made a masterpiece of her portrait. But it wasn't seen that way when the painting went on public view. Instead, it became an avatar for everything that people said about Madame Gautreau, that she used too much makeup, that she attempted to obviously to make an entrance on the Paris scene, that how could two Americans, Virginie Gautreau, who was from New Orleans, or Sargent, another American, how could she be the most stylish Parisienne in Paris? And how could he be the most stylish portraitist in Paris? They both had been called out in the press some years before for trying to beat the French at their own game. Or as one of the nastiest critics put it, how could Sargent paint a woman who had already painted herself? We do have a section about power dressing through the ability to wear every bit of lace and ribbon and medals that your aristocratic rank allowed you, that you see here at center with Lord Londonderry, or on the left and right, the power of the military rank with Ian Hamilton on the left and Frank Swetnam on the right. Swetnam, the Governor General of Malaysia, wearing his tropical whites with decorations, grabbing onto a fabric, a big piece of Malaysian brocade. If ever there was a portrait of empire, it's these. But not every gentleman decided that he needed to dress up to show power. Here is a man dressed down. His plain blue serge blazer and white flannel trousers don't tell you anything about his rank or status. Neither does the Windsor chair in which he sits. All you need is his name, John D. Rockefeller. He didn't need to dress up. Another way of showing your position was to align yourself with the old masters. Here, Mrs. de Meyer associating herself with a Boucher portrait that you see at upper center, or Mrs. Hirsch at the right, dressed in antique lace and brocade, recalling a portrait by Velázquez at the lower center. These are ways to align modern life and modern women with the great art of the past, something that Sargent did so well, for example, in his portrait of Lady Agnew, that all London was at his feet. He based this sensuous half-length portrait of a woman on 18th century British prototypes by artists like Reynolds and Romney, who you see here. The sensuous fall of fabric over her knees, that incredibly wet, wide strokes of paint that define her lavender sash. Well, Sargent was acclaimed as a portraitist on both sides of the Atlantic, but he got tired of formal portrait work and gave it up as much as he could in about 1907. But he never gave up his interest and love of fabric in folds of drapery in how they capture the light. And he painted it in casual settings with family and friends throughout his life. On the left, his sister Violet in 1885, outdoors in a beautiful white dress, a la polonaise, meaning rushed up at the sides. Or at the right, Violet's daughter, Rosemary, lying in a field in the Alps, actually twice, because both of these figures are Rosemary in the early 20th century. Sargent had a studio prop at this point, a white taffeta skirt, and we see it over and over again with Jane de Glen on the left or Rosemary at right. We know these women didn't hike into the Alps wearing these big wide white skirts. Here's a photograph of them with their boots and their heavy woolens and their hiking staffs. But on the right, you see Sargent dressing them up and arranging them, just as he had arranged his formal portraits, making luminous compositions of family and friends wrapped and draped, merging into the background, the depth of field disappearing, and in effect, painting landscapes of taffeta and rivers of cashmere shawls, making imaginary pictures out of whole cloth. Thank you. I'd like to thank the support we received from our funders, the Bank of America, the Terra Foundation, and the donors that you see listed here. And I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Erica. That was wonderful. We have a number of questions, and there are some that overlap. So we've had two questions about the ways Sargent painted hands. One member says, my friends and I could not help but wonder if Sargent had a hard time painting hands and fingers. It appears to us that they all seemed quite long and not in proportion to the model. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I've heard a lot of people say that. I think Sargent's hands are actually quite magical. You'll see a difference if you look at them chronologically. Madame X's hands, for example, in an earlier portrait are quite a lot more academically painted, if I could put it that way, reflecting his training at the École des Beaux-Arts. He moves away from that kind of depiction later in his career, and he uses them as expressive, sort of nervous notes in his paintings, notes that remind us of, as one critic put it, the sort of nervous tension of the modern age. He also abbreviates them, just as he abbreviates the fabrics, which means he draws your attention to the face, which is, after all, the most recognizable part of the portrait.
Thank you. We also had a couple of questions about his interest in painting black on black. One was, would it be possible that the use of black only was used so often because it was required at that time for grieving family and women for extended periods of time? And the other related question is it known if he used chromatic black? Did he mix blue and reds into black?
Both very good questions. What I didn't talk about was the development during this same period of the dye industry, which changes quite a bit over the course of the 19th century with the development of what are called aniline dyes. So they're very, very bright colors that you start to see in fashion, like that acid green dress I showed, that are the result not of dyes that are made from plant material or from earth material, but from chemicals in the lab. And they create all kinds of brilliant colors that also make their way into artists' pigments. So the aniline dyes weren't just greens and pinks and blues. There was also an aniline black that became very, very popular. So black clothing, yes, of course, used for mourning, but not only. And black became a fashion item during this period as well, the blackest black you could get. Madame Gautreau, for example, in her black gown was not in mourning at this time. The other question about the painting itself, yes, Sargent mixed all kinds of colors into his blacks on black and white on white. The whites are virtual rainbows. The blacks often have blues in them, and sometimes little hints of other colors as well. So that's absolutely correct.
Thank you. I think we have time for a couple more questions. We had two questions about your choice of the paintings. The first was, did the existence of the original garments seen in the paintings influence what paintings you chose? And the other question was there one that got away in terms of portraits that you would love to have included in this exhibition but weren't able to get?
Very good questions. The one that got away, if I can just say, yes, there was one that got away that I tried to get up until after the book was even on press, was a portrait of Lord Dalhousie, a British aristocratic sitter wearing a white suit, who had been standing out in the sun for a while. So you can see the line of his hat as a pale where his hat was and sunburn on the rest of his face. It's a portrait that is modern in every way, except that it's based entirely on Van Dyck. So it is right on that tightrope that I mentioned. The painting belonged to the family into the time of the pandemic, and then it got sold in a private sale, and I was not able to convince the person who had just bought it to part with it for the show. It is illustrated in the book. As I picked I had a high standard of quality for this exhibition. I wanted the best of Sargent's portraits. I also knew from previous experience how much room they take. In other words, you can't hang a whole bunch of them close together because they need space. They need to breathe. The whole gallery is absolutely full, and there are under 100 objects in the show, unlike several other exhibitions that we did. There's 71 objects, including the clothes. And I had to be extremely selective. So yes, if there was a match, I did want to go for it, but I do know of a couple of other matches that I did not pursue for one reason or another. I might have known where the painting was. I know about a dress that got sold at auction, but couldn't find it. So I didn't go after every single one of them.
Great. Well, it is past time. So as the slide says, if we did not get to your questions, or if you have additional questions, you can email us at membership@mfa.org, and we will work with Erica to answer your questions. Erica, thank you so much for being here this evening. This was wonderful. And to all of our guests, thank you for joining us. And we hope to see you soon at the MFA and in the Sargent exhibition specifically. Thanks very much and have a good night.